Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Today is Tuesday. It's about to be reset day in NA. It's soon gonna be reset day in EU. With this reset, we now have only one left before the release of Season 4. The 26th, 27th of July is going to be the last of the resets for this season before we enter Season 4. So it's gonna be good to continue to check on how the things have been going in the raid, because we haven't looked at them for a couple of weeks by this point. Also, I was almost forgetting, it's back to being camera strike day, because it is way too hot to put up the whole camera setup when it's 37 goddamn degrees. What we're looking for today is how things are going in the raid now that we're getting closer to Season 4. We're gonna have players interested into knowing how things are going to shape up in the meta of Season 4. Perhaps not many, because Season 4 is not quite the serious season compared to the previous ones we have had this expansion, but still as long as you want to play the season, you might be still interested into knowing whether or not your spec is going to be a good one or a bad one. So we haven't looked at the raid in a couple of weeks. We have gotten some balance tuning in between, particularly the damage buff to Affliction was the main change of the patch, because Destruction was of course delayed until the start of Season 4. Talking about the start of Season 4, we don't know. We don't know if any balance tuning beyond what Blizzard has already announced is going to happen. So we know Destruction is getting its AoE nerfed, we know Survival is getting its AoE nerfed, but we don't know any more than this. Personally, I am still very high on HOPIUM that any more balance tuning is going to happen in Season 4. As I said, I wish for some shake-up in the meta. I wish for some specs to just pop out of nowhere and become much better than they have been the whole expansion, but for the moment, let's just check at how things have been going so far in the raid. Important thing to mention when it comes to popularity. We congratulated Destruction Warlock for passing Balanced Druid in popularity for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and that thing is already gone. Balanced Druid has already surpassed Destruction once again. Now, perhaps it might have to do with two things. Number one, Destro is about to be nerfed very soon at the start of Season 4, so perhaps Warlock players are starting to take precautions in playing something else other than Destruction. And number two, Affliction was buffed, as we will see from the damage of the specs in the raid so far. Talking about growth of other specs, there is something interesting happening, actually. Perhaps some of you might explain this phenomenon. We have Arms Warrior, which continues to grow in popularity compared to last week, but we also have Enhancement Shaman, and we also have Frost Death Knight, and we also have Outlaw Rogue. So it's a whole bunch of melee specs getting more representation compared to a couple of weeks ago. Other specs, of course, losing out in these melee specs growing are going to be Shadow Priest, Frost Mage, Elemental Shaman, all losing representation. So there is some sort of melee DPS uprising in the raid happening right now. Now, the thing that was more interesting is that a couple of weeks ago when we left, we knew that Affliction Warlock was getting buffed by 5% in all of their damage, and there were some whispers, some voices in the corridors saying that Affliction was now simming the highest out of all Warlocks, or at the very least was a very competitive spec now in the raid. Now, what we see in a couple of weeks, even though we just saw the popularity and Affliction is still dead last in amount of play compared to all the other specs, still in the performance we see that Affliction is now the 6th better performing spec in the raid. So they went from dead last and then like bottom 3, bottom 4, all the way up to top 6. Now they are frighteningly close to finishing the tier in the horror that is going to be top 3 specs being all 3 Warlock specs, which is quite the horrible situation. We have gotten this before. We have gotten this record before with Rogue, actually. We have gotten Subtlety, Assassination and Outlaw being in the top 3 in Sanctum, actually. So Warlock might get to have the same thing by the end of Sepulcher. Many of the other specs at the top have not changed nearly as much, you know, not being changed, not being buffed or nerfed. So Frost, Survival, Outlaw after the buff is still there. Windwalker was buffed as well and it is still there. Then you have the usual 2 Shaman specs also there. The only other one growing a little bit more is Unholy Death Knight, being much better than what they used to be for most of this tier and most of last tier, which was bottom half of the performance in the raid. Because of all of these specs growing, because of all of these specs doing better, one of the specs losing out is Assassination, which has lost even more than before. We already covered the loss of Subtlety, which used to be towards the top and now it is towards the bottom. For most of the other spec, however, there hasn't been any major change when it comes to the performance. Still, it's gonna be interesting to see how players look at this and then how do they translate this into choosing what to play in Season 4. For example, we have just seen that Balanced Druid and Fire Mage have consistently been one of the most played specs in the raid for this entire tier, but also this entire expansion. Yet, they show as quite low in the performance. So are we still going to have that many players confident in Season 4 that they will be, still good even though the performance isn't really showing that? Or are they just going to flee and immigrate to a different class? Perhaps, a random one, a Warlock, for example. We will see. We will see just how many mages are going to give up on mage in Season 4 or how many balanced druids are going to give up on balance at the start of Season 4. Talking about the raid itself, it was of course obvious that given this large amount of nerfs that many of the bosses were now going to be quite more simple to defeat given the nerfs they have received. They have all increased quite significantly in their ease of completion. Even the jailer himself, it is quite higher than what it was before, almost 50% higher than what it was before. We can also draw a comparison to what we have seen before in terms of ease of defeating the boss itself, because these are right now the kills on the jailer, which are approaching the 900 with a couple of resets left into this tier. It is, I'm going to assume, a safe guess that we're going to break the 1000 kills on the jailer before the start of Season 4. These are still quite less than the Sylvanas kills. Then again, the Sylvanas tier lasted for 2 more months than what the Sepulcher tier lasted, so I guess Blizzard had to really break the glass in case of emergency and giga nerf all of the last 4 bosses to make sure that the number of kills was even somewhat decent. It's still not good, but it's now decent. Of course, this decent number of kills is going to be tainted by the fact that all of these bosses have been made trivial compared to how they were supposed to be for the most part. You can also see the hilarity of the difficulty in graphs like these ones. This is Anduin, the Anduin difficulty, the Anduin progression of kills. You can see that after the several sets of nerfs, you can see the spike in number of kills by day over time in Anduin, how large that is. Even more hilariously, you can see the many lines of the jailer nerfs all throughout the progression, and you can see just how steep the jumps in the kill numbers of the jailer have gone because of the very hefty nerfs that the jailer has received over time. Compare this to a reasonably unnerfed boss which has been quite smooth throughout its duration, like Fatescribe in Sanctum. As you can see, it is quite a normal curve with many kills, progressing at a decent and average curve. Somewhat same could be said for Sylvanas, which was nerfed certainly, but not nearly as much and also as often as the bosses in Sepulcher. People have been wondering, debating on how tough Season 4 is going to be as a question mark. After all, if Season 4 starts now and the release of Dragonflight is in December, we only have barely 4 months for this tier, which means with rotating raids, with every one of these 3 raids only being available for 1 week every 3 weeks, it means we're going to have at best 4 to 5 weeks per every raid. So the difficulty is likely not going to be super hard because you only have 4 to 5 weeks to even just kill the boss, let alone farm them. Perhaps the tier itself is going to be much more laid back. It's going to be much easier for guilds, many of the better guilds, to clear the entire raid in 1 week. The more average, middling guilds will clear the raid in a couple of weeks, so 6 weeks total to clear all of the 3 raids, and then the other ones will still have time to take 3 to 4 weeks for each of the raid and still have time to complete the entire raid. Now, there are also other questions, like for example, are we getting the default, the original version of these bosses, or are we going to get their versions at the end of their tier, so after several sets of nerfs? Right? Are we getting the original version of Painsmith, or are we getting the nerfed version of Painsmith? Could be an interesting question. Are we getting the original version of Stone Legion Generals, or are we getting the nerfed and then nerfed and then nerfed and nerfed and nerfed? nerfed version of Stone Legion generals? Those could be some interesting questions. I'm assuming, just because of the duration of the tier, that they are going to be the nerfed version, right? Because otherwise it would make it quite difficult to progress in time before the release of Dragonflight. That being said, I guess at this point there isn't really much else to do other than wait for the actual release of the season. There is, of course, as I said, I'm still hoping for a hefty round of balance tuning to save Season 4. At the end of the day, people keep saying that Season 4 is not a serious season, you shouldn't take it as seriously, it's not going to be as hardcore progression focused as the previous seasons, so why not just shake things up? Right? Why not just make Red Paladin and Feral Druid the two best in slot melee specs for raids? Why not make Elemental Shaman and Shadow Priest the 2-go specs for your ranged picks? After all, as you said, it's not a serious season, so why not just change the balancing for fun? That is what I hope is going to happen at the start of Season 4. I hope Blizzard will just change things up a bit. I'm just gonna be quite disappointed, honestly, if I will have to start, for example, trying to push some Mythic Plus keys and I will still have to see Blood DK, Survival Hunter and Destro Warlock in every single group. That would just be a little bit too tiring for my tastes. I don't think I will be able to stomach it for another season, so that is my last hope before the release of Season 4, to get changes like these ones before the release of the patch itself. I'm not too concerned about the difficulty of the raid. I do think it's going to be quite the easy one. I don't think it's going to frustrate people in not being able to kill the bosses before the release of Dragonflight and similar things. I think it's going to be a much more laid-back season, basically not too worried about balancing the raid, about being tough. Blizzard kind of showed us this when they said, you know what, Season 4 is not even gonna have Hall of Fame. So clearly it is bound to be much easier if you don't even bother to have Hall of Fame as a reward for your raid progression, right? With this being said, I guess it's time to leave each other at the start of this second to last week of Season 3 of 9.2.5. Thank you guys, of course, to all of my patrons who have supported me so far. Great appreciation for all of you, allowing me to continue to churn out content for a while. Nowadays getting even more crowded because of the alpha and the beta of Dragonflight. It's gonna be quite an exciting period for me in making videos. I'm gonna be enjoying it a lot, even though it's gonna make me busy a lot, but knowing I have your support while I do this is gonna make this all the sweeter for me personally. That being said, for further support you can of course like and comment down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Not to mention, for further sycophants behavior, you can follow me on Twitter and of course subscribe to my Patreon down at these links over here. Subscribing to my Patreon will give you access to my Discord server, where you can be in more direct contact with me if you feel, I don't know, interested in giving feedback about previous content, asking questions or tips or critiques about future content, or simply to have a chat with me. I am usually available in Discord at all times, provided I am anywhere near my PC or my phone at the time. With this being said, thank you guys again, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, Season 4 raid, easier or not, I'm still totally not okay with giving mythic rewards being portals and normal and heroic rewards being a mountain title. That's not fair at all.